Hi, this is Dr. Carl Goldkamp. If you're interested in learning about the ketogenic diet like I was, to save my own life, then this is probably the podcast for you. 8 years ago, I knew nothing about it. 6 years ago, it saved my life. 3 years ago, I started researching and talking with some of the authorities in the field and attending medical conferences about this to understand why and how keto so dramatically changed my and my wife's Judy's lives. The purpose of this podcast is to share our journey of discoveries with you and understanding how keto is so effective in improving so many different conditions, from obesity, epilepsy, diabetes, infertility, MS, Alzheimer's, heart disease, to name a few. So take a step away from all the hype you've probably heard and roll up your sleeves with me and join me weekly to explore this living miracle that anyone can access. We'll talk science, we'll talk food. We'll explore its history and evolution to today, which is that the sheer wonder of the ketogenic way of eating has changed untold number of lives, unlike anything before it. And in case I forget to mention it, please join our Facebook group, Keto Naturopath. Hi, this is Dr. Carl Goldkamp, and welcome back to another episode of the Keto Naturopath. Well, as I mentioned last time, we're going to be doing a series on cancer and try to explore it in different ways. In part, I will be as the clinician on the outside saying, this is how I would set myself up. So we talked a little bit about that last time. Now I want to take a step back and to do a bigger picture of some contributing factors to cancer. And I'm not going to go into environmental causes of cancer. That is all the toxins and so on. That it's a valid issue. It's just not the issue I'm going to be talking about today. It's back there. We're going to be talking about diet and some hormonal responses that really are associated with the onset of cancer and the metabolism of cancer as well. So I mentioned Dr. Thomas Siegfried up at Boston College a number of times because he wrote his book called Cancer as a Metabolic Disease. And he's picking right up from Dr. Warburg's observation back in just after World War I. A lot of things happened just after World War I, besides the plague, by the way, the first pandemic. And that was that cancer cells increased their appetite for glucose, glycolysis. And please go back and listen to both the prequels I did before talking to Dr. Siegfried and the couple of podcasts we did together on this conversation. You'll get a larger understanding. So I'm not going to tease into too many of those details, but you do need to know that the cancer really has a preferred fuel of glucose. So given that has been established, pretty much out for about 100 years now, the idea in treatment of cancer, which we'll be talking about in part, the treatment of cancer is what if we block the source of glucose? B is, how would we do that? So if we blocked the source of glucose, could cancer survive, continue to grow? And the answer generally is no. And then it's not an automatic yes or automatic no, but it's a mostly no because cancers vary. And certain types of cancers respond very well to dropping the accessibility, the availability of glucose in the blood, and therefore to cancers to grow. So how would you do that? You would drop the carbs. You would drop your sources, your exogenous sources of glucose. Exogenous being came in through your mouth. So your endogenous sources of glucose, which you don't have any conscious control over, is your body making its glucose. So that's gluconeogenesis. I know this is basic for some of you, but let's just lay it down. Okay, so you got the gluconeogenesis. Where does that come from? Well, that can come from your body. Basically, if you didn't eat anything, your body would still make glucose at a lower rate, we presume. So you're not going to be at a high rate. You'll be a lower rate because glucose is necessary as a fuel. But however, it also has a backup fuel. Some people think it's not a backup fuel. It should have been the primary fuel, which is ketones. I'm kind of thinking that as well, from my experience. And they have dramatically different effects on growing cancer. Ketones, or to be in ketosis, And a nutritional ketosis, not a diabetic ketosis, would shrink most cancers, certainly keep them from growing. Okay, so that's pretty much an observation that's agreed upon by a lot. And feel free to Google or PubMed these particular claims, because you can go into a lot of references you will find. But start with the podcast I referenced before, and you'll be on your way. And there's references there too. Okay, so you now have that. So what brought that about? So, all right, you have cancer. And now you go, all right, and now I have to really sort of pay attention to my glucose supplies. Am I making glucose? And how am I making glucose? Am I making too much glucose? What can I do about that? Or am I still eating glucose via carbs, in which you can do something about? So that would be the first thing that you have to address. Then the second thing is, okay, well, you're going to have to learn. You're going to have to participate. This isn't a do you. This isn't a done for you sort of situation. This is learning as you go, asking progressively more and more detailed questions, because you are the master of your own body, not the chemotherapy people, not the oncologists that are going to be working on you, telling you what to do. You have to be the glue that binds all that together. Learn better questions to ask your coaches, your teachers. Did you know the word doctor actually is from the Latin word teacher? So it's easy to get those two mixed up. Okay, so you're going to have to address that. And so dropping your exogenous carbs is certainly at the first part of it, and that's why a ketogenic diet, and that's why looking at cancer as a metabolic disease is important, and that's what that addresses. It also, your cancer, your mitochondria, it's they call it a mitochondrial disease because the mitochondria has been damaged, and therefore making of glucose, burning of glucose in the cytosol, which is the area outside of the mitochondria in your cells, is really what takes over. It's an inefficient way of creating energy, but it can quickly replicate. So maybe it's not efficient, not quick, but there's a lot of these little factors, if you will, making a lot, using glucose quickly, so it can compensate in that regard. And that's a process we've learned, most of us have learned in high school, if not in college, if you went into biology, related sciences, life sciences. So how did we get here? How did cancer pick you? Well, even Warburg comes back to saying he's not quite sure how cancer got started. You know, he does feel that it's an environmental aspect. And he died in the early 1970s, by the way. From what I heard, he was not a very nice man. He was very abrupt and didn't tolerate other people's opinions very well. But he was a real smart guy, and that's why we're still reading about his work. So he thought it was primarily an environmental cause. But that topic has been opened up a lot. And as much as we talk about glucose, it's really about, now we're talking about what we think are the highly associated conditions to cancer. And we can't call them causes because very, very few things have that kind of definitive data to say that's cause, usually a correlation or an association. Okay, so what I'm getting at is things that increase your insulin for a prolonged period of time are thought to be the number one most likely causative factor, cause of exposure over a lifetime. So let me reword it differently. Whatever causes you to have a sustained period of high insulin. So if you were to say in a 24-hour period, if you were to count up, if you really knew where your insulin was, in other words, and you can get blood tests done, but I don't think there is such a thing as an insulin, continuous insulin monitor. That would be great. That we have CGMs, which are continual glucose monitors, but not CIMs. However, so anyway, the idea is the longer your insulin is elevated times time is thought to be the most likely causative factor in most cancers. And so therefore they say, who do we know that has sustained elevated insulin over a period of time? And those are diabetics, of course. And so We then look at all the associated conditions and cancers that are associated with diabetes. So you have cardiovascular, of course, you have cerebral dementia, you have all sorts of cancers. So we'll leave it at that. And that's something you can Google as well. So let me express this a little bit differently. And we're going to get into a thing called incretins, which is something you have not heard about, which is important and has a lot to do with how your body does increase insulin. So let's say I give you two choices of foods to eat, or basically you're going to be part of an experiment. You're going to have both of these foods. You're going to have an apple, or let's say 3 apples to make sure it's enough, and you're going to eat 3 apples. Well, we know that, it's a fruit, and so it has glucose, and so we're going to measure your glucose, and we're going to measure your blood insulin. Okay? So we go, well, that's interesting. We're going to measure that, and then we're going to take those 3 apples, just like the ones you ate, and we're going to make them into applesauce. That is, we're going to leave the peels and everything else in there. Everything that was in the apples you ate, we're going to also put into the applesauce. Same exact items that you're eating, and we're going to measure your glucose again. So what do you think is going to happen? Well, guess what? Your insulin is going to be pretty much about the same. You ate the same food. The only thing you did is you made it a little more refined. You processed it. You really mashed it up. I'm not talking about juicing. I'm saying everything. Whatever fiber, you're eating the whole thing. We just made it very mashed up, very fine. Put it in a blender, okay? So you ate both, and your insulin was about the same, your glucose was about the same in both situations. Their glycemic index number was pretty much identical in both situations. But the applesauce, we'll call it, kicked off a much bigger insulin response. So same food, the only thing you did was mechanical processing. So we're going to say it's a processed food because we mashed it up. So the applesauce versus the whole apple, and you had the whole 100%, calorie for calorie, calories are the same. It was just the process, just mashing up, just the blending up. Increased your insulin response. What the heck was that about? Well, what it's about is a thing called GIP. It's an incretin. You have 2 incretins. Sounds like a Greek village, doesn't it? You have 2 incretins, and one is called GIP, and the other is called GLP. And so the GIP, and so basically, in all intents and purposes, they're very similar. One is released from the top part of your small intestine, and the other is released from the lower part of your large intestine. And so when you think about the applesauce person, or think about you who lived a life of eating applesauce as opposed to eating apples directly, the difference would be your exposure to insulin over your life. So if you're in a village and one village ate applesauce all the time and the other village ate apples, calorically, they're the same, isocaloric. In terms of glucose, they're isoglucose. But they're not the same in terms of insulin. So one village would be more likely to get various illnesses, cancers, and so on and so forth, maybe even probably be diabetic over a lifetime, and subsequent generations, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the only thing we did. So we can't say it's environmental toxins in this particular situation. We can't say it's anything else but the mechanical blending, processing of the food. Interesting. So what's the difference there? Well, when you blend things up, when you process things like this, carbs in particular, when you take a refined carb, a non-refined carbohydrate, and you blend it up and becomes a refined carbohydrate, is that it doesn't stimulate these cells in the upper part of your small intestine called your K cells. So it doesn't stimulate these K cells to secrete the incretins. The incretins there is called GIP, which glucose-dependent insulinogenic peptide. peptide being a protein, meaning that it's a glucose-dependent protein that kicks up insulin. So the insulin is dependent on the insulin amount. Okay then, so GIP gets kicked up. What does GIP do? GIP is the messenger that goes over to tell your pancreas, secrete the insulin, secrete the insulin. I'm telling you, secrete the insulin. So it was stimulated by the food coming down out of your stomach, your gastric emptying. It came out of your stomach and into the top of your small intestine, and it woke up the K cells. And the K cell says, holy cow, we got to get over and talk to the pancreas. The pancreas says, holy cow, we got to secrete some insulin. And it does. So it's the messenger that is sent to talk to the pancreas. So the GIP, the incretin, goes to the pancreas. That's the one. And the difference between whether some foods, items, or whatever wake up your K cells to secrete the incretins to go talk to the pancreas or not depends on how refined they are. Let me give you another example. So let's say, we've talked about the glucose tolerance test, right? So GGT, glucose tolerance test, is a test that I prescribe a lot of times. And ideally, you should always do it with, here's what the test is. You take 75 grams of glucose. It's given to you in this little cup. And actually, just before it's given to you, you come in the morning and you have your fasting glucose taken and you have ideally your fasting insulin taken as well. Unfortunately, not many doctors do that, but that's what I did and what you should do. And then you get your 75 grams of glucose, you down that and you hate it. And then a half hour later, they measure your glucose and your insulin. And then a half hour later, glucose and your insulin. And an hour later, glucose and insulin. And ideally, if you carried that out for about 4 hours, you'd be doing the Kraft test, right? So that's what the glucose tolerance test is. So now here's the twist in this particular story. The twist is this. The twist is that I give you a choice. Do you want it as an IV? So the IV is me shooting it into your bloodstream directly. Let's put it in a bottle and it drips, but it's fast and it gets into your bloodstream. So you can have the glucose go directly into your bloodstream, or you can take it in your mouth and you can swallow it. And we're going to measure your insulin and your glucose over time, like I just told you about. Which do you think is going to be higher? Which one do you think is going to be the same? Do you think your glucose in your bloodstream is going to be measured the same? Do you think your insulin response will be measured the same? All right, here are the answers, since you can't tell me. That your glucose is more or less about the same. That kind of makes sense. It's quickly absorbed, by the way. When you take it orally, it's into your stomach, it goes into your bloodstream. So it doesn't have very far to go to get into your bloodstream. But the insulin, your IV, the IV sugar that you had shot into your veins, did not really kick up much of an insulin effect. Whereas the insulin you took orally did kick up your insulin a lot. And so you have a big disparity of the oral glucose you took went down into the top of your small intestine and your stomach, because I said it was absorbed in the stomach as well. Yes, that's correct. Stimulates your K cells, and your K cells stimulate the incretins. They go charging over to talk to your pancreas and saying, quick, jack up the insulin. It's coming, glucose is coming. Whereas when it was shot into your veins, you did not get that wake-up response. You did not get that wake-up response. And so your insulin didn't go up. So you go, well, I guess if I have all my food, all my sugar shot into my veins, that's a healthier way. Or is that what you're saying, Dr. Goldkamp? Well, it's pretty impossible to sort of eat that way, for sure. Come back to that in a second. But given what I just said about the amount of insulin you're exposed to over your life is what determines whether you're healthy or sick. Diabetes, et cetera, and all the other things are associated with high insulin levels. Certainly high glucose levels, but basically it's high insulin levels. You could say, yeah, a healthier, those two outcomes was the lower insulin, and that was the one that was the IV. Nobody eats that way, and so therefore, why, how can you explain this? The explanation is this, is that it was a survival advantage for you to have the ability, right? Because as we evolved, we ate food. We didn't get anything IV, obviously. We ate food. And as foods came down the GI tract, they stimulated different receptors, of course. And so the pancreas, which makes the insulin and also makes glucagon and so on and so forth, they think the remnants or the precursors to the pancreas are actually within our GI tract, where the K cells. And so they migrated outside of the GI tract and became a separate organ called the pancreas. And the K cells kind of stayed behind, and they have the messenger. Kind of like having at your front door, some people have the visual camera there so they can see who's at the front door without going to the front door. So it's like that camera, and they get notified when somebody's at the front door, as opposed to when something's put through the window, or I can't think of the analogy. But so that's the top of your small intestine, and also at the bottom of your GI tract as well. So those who eat insulinogenic food, and most insulinogenic food is pretty high is pretty high glucose. But I just told you about the apples versus the applesauce villages. Those who are eating applesauce, that was pretty insulinogenic. So just the treatment of the food, just the processing, the blending, the mechanical blending of the foods drove a much higher insulin level. And therefore, that's an unhealthier level to have. So what I'm also leading at, all those people who thought blender drinks are great, in fact, I used to think blender drinks were great. So if you took all the plant food, whatever plants you're talking about, and you blended them up through a Vitamix, really pulverized the suckers, you would make it all the equivalent of being a high sugar diet in essence. And it would be highly insulinogenic. Whereas if they had the whole food, whether it's the beets or the whatever else you would put in there, it would be far less insulinogenic. Isn't that interesting? So as much as you thought you were making really healthy blender drinks, you just were demolishing the effects of the whole food plant. So now, yes, I'm talking about plants because those are the things we blend up. We don't blend up meats. We make hamburgers, but that's not exactly blending things up. Okay? So you got my point. Just the mechanical blending things up drove up your insulin. Isn't that something? So anyways, that's what incretins are about. So I wanted to hit that for a second, and it's just really interesting. So if you think of your life as your area under the curve, your insulin curve, so if you have a lot of moments throughout the day, or you have sustained high insulin throughout the day, times time, times week, months, years, and so on and so forth, you are setting yourself up for a lot of disease. That's pretty straightforward. The insulin is highly associated with a number of cancers, period. Hyperinsulinemia, to be correct. Whereas low insulin is not. So I got into processed foods, and then I was just talking about blender drinks. But what they show, there was another study here that I'm trying to get it up in front of me. It's really interesting. It's over a period of time in which the economy. So this goes back starting in 1909. So this is before World War I. And what it measures is fiber intake over the last 100 years as an average intake of the food that was available. And so what you saw is when the times were good, the fiber decreased in people's diets. So you could say, well, they had more pastries and so on and so forth, and the fiber was removed. Whereas in the difficult times, the Depression and pre-World War I was a pretty tough time as well. The fiber was pretty high. People were you think of their jobs, they were all laborers for the most part. All their ancestors were laborers for the most part. And so it wasn't until really 1960s, 1959, that we're finally getting out of World War II and recovering from that, is that processed foods came back on and they dropped the fiber. Now I'm talking about fiber as low fiber being bad, but I'm using fiber as a proxy for processed foods. Fiber by itself is not an independent variable about cancer or anything else. But fiber being low is low in processed foods. So what I'm saying is, as processed foods became higher and higher and higher, is that the associated insulin became more and more people had prolonged periods of high insulin. So hyperinsulinemia became more and more common. Obesity got started because of the hyperinsulinemia, because the job of insulin is to take the glucose and quickly put it into fat cells, right? So your fat cells get stoked. So as time went by and processed foods, in the very least, just blender drinks, right? So we just started at blender drinks, not even getting into all the chemicals and all this other stuff they put into it. But as our diet became more and more less whole foods, less just from the earth to you, less meat that's on the bone, less veggies that are out of the garden, and more processed things. You had the hot dogs, you had the potato chips, all these other things. Well, you're having, yes, a lot less fiber. You're also getting a lot less nutrients and everything else, but you're getting less foods that stimulate the incretins, that stimulate your insulin. Isn't that interesting? So, okay, that was that. So basically, I want to say that when we're looking at cancer, we talk about cancer and cancer basically has a glucose addiction. So what do we mean by that? It's being a bit facetious for sure. Cancer takes up glucose. It needs glucose. And so therefore, this thing called a PET scan, which measures your uptake, it's a little radioactive, measures the uptake of glucose. And that's how they detect where your cancer is, what spots light up. They light up because those are the highest consuming areas of glucose. Those cells are taking up more glucose. Therefore, they are cancer cells. So that's what you look at. And that's how you can tell if cancer is getting worse or cancer is getting better. Is there more over time or is there fewer spots like that over time? So cancer has an addiction to glucose. Cut off the glucose, cancer will probably improve. That's what the ketogenic diet is all about. Can the ketogenic diet by and in itself cure cancer? Well, nobody would say that. And right now, no place in the world is the ketogenic diet the sole treatment for cancer. If you're off doing it on your own, that's a whole different thing. That's you and your own decision making. But in terms of actual hospitals and the very few places that talk about or encourage you to do a ketogenic diet in addition to whatever chemo they're putting you on or whatever therapy they're putting you on, it's a great idea. It most certainly should go along. So only, as I mentioned last time, in other countries are they really getting serious and they lock in hyperthermia with ketogenic diet and so on and so forth. So that's what I wanted to go over today, is that cancer does have a glucose addiction. It needs a lot of glucose. If you cut down the glucose by obviously dropping the carbs significantly, if not deleting them completely, that's why people fast. And before the ketogenic diet, fasting was all the rage. The reason fasting was all the rage because it was effective. But the problem is eventually you got to go back to eating. So they still have places and you can go online, great Netflix movie. I can't remember the name of it, but just put in fasting. I'm sure you'll find 2 or 3 Netflix documentaries that go over that. They have places just like in late 1800s and early 1900s in the US that people would fast for 3 weeks on water only. And they would come out and they have exercise and their games and so on and so forth, but they would be just water. And they would be followed by doctors. And so these fasting centers for people who are sick are followed by doctors. They have, they take your blood and so on and so forth. So they make sure you're doing okay. And if you're not doing okay, they start to wean food back into your diet. And so before you leave, you get put back on food, but they gradually start you with, broths and juices and so on and so forth. So there you go. As an independent factor, glucose is a very big deal. Fasting was very effective. At some point, you got to think about food, and certainly have Dr. Fung's up in Toronto, the whole fasting aspect, and it's totally valid, and it's been valid for centuries before. But when you come back to eating food, you have to think about how are you going to eat? What will that diet look like so you don't end up starving yourself forever? It just basically means dropping your carbs. Now, my line of work where I've been sort of evolving towards is, I got that, drop the carbs, and that's clearly a big deal in my life, but also dropping the fats being predominantly protein. And protein seems to be the best effect on incretins, as we've talked about. It definitely stimulates your they get acknowledged as they go by, as opposed to the applesauce kind of thing. So that's a note that I think I probably want to end on. And we're going to explore incretins a little more so you understand that. But it is a fascinating idea, and it differentiates, why whole foods as an independent factor. So when people go, oh, just don't do processed foods, we're talking whole foods. Call it what it is. So if you have your meat that's still on the bone, you got it from the butcher, or you got it from the meat section. You didn't just buy hamburger patties and so on and so forth. They were slightly processed. Just get to the real meat. There's that. Primarily protein, because it has fat in it. You get what you need. I'm more and more certain of that. People go, wait a minute, that's too extreme for me. Well, I don't know how to give you the truth, but if you are in a place of need and of hurt and of cancer, I would definitely be paying attention to this. The problem with cancer and high protein, to couple these two ideas together, is that you come back to glutamine is also a preferred fuel for various cancers. And so it's a conditionally essential amino acid, glutamine. So you can't go crazy on the protein. So you have to sort of be a low carb. You have to be ketogenic primarily, and not really have very high protein. You calculate it at 1.5 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight is really the formula there. And you would focus on higher fat, maybe not too high, but high enough. And then you would graduate from that and get back to normal. But that's the only other concern. But if one didn't have cancer as a concern, we are primarily, I haven't had a salad for a year now. Last salad I had was a year ago, August, and I don't miss it. And we used to have huge vegetable gardens. I miss the idea of making our own relish and putting away a lot of the pickles and so on and so forth, so you can pull them out in the middle of winter and all that sort of things. But we do, it's there down the road right now we're doing fine with this, and this is a remarkable chapter in our lives. Okay, so I am going to end on that by saying that this was a background on cancer and really some strong contributing factors that have to do with glucose and insulin specifically relative to its association with cancer. Okay, so you take those away is the thinking, and you're really what you're doing is you're treating the mitochondria as best as you possibly can. What's good for the mitochondria is going to be good for your health. Does that help you think about it better? But that's what we're doing. We're trying to get out with the sugar, certainly out with the processed foods. I hope you got that message. And then in for the whole foods, be them leafy green salads and various meats and fish. I wanted to add a little more on the incretins because I know that you'll probably forget it by next time we talk, and this is important. So I'm going to give you 2 examples. And one is an example of patients that are put on what they call a TPN in the hospital. So TPN is total parenteral nutrition. So that can happen for a number of reasons, and certainly can be with people who are in coma and they're just lying down. So that's why they don't die due to malnourishment. They can stay in a coma for a long period of time. But there's others that have nothing to do with a coma that are on TPN because they can't eat, whether it's mouth operations or something else, or head and neck cancers they're getting over. So at least that they are getting nutrition, quote unquote. It's manufactured, right? It's somebody else putting together vitamins and fats, and you can imagine how good or bad that must be. But the fact is they're not eating anything. It goes directly into their bloodstream. And so now you have a group of people that get nutrition that have nothing to do with eating. That was obviously never done before up until modern medicine. So now you can compare these two. And so when you have nothing that goes through your GI tract, you do not stimulate any incretin release from the upper part of the small intestine to the lower part of the low intestine, the GIP and the GPL is the name of the other one. And they have similar functions. So what happens is that incretins have a lot of functions. They have a direct effect on the brain. We've already talked about pancreas. It also secretes insulin as well. Sorry, secretes glucagon as well as insulin, and that's what we've been talking about. It has to do with insulin sensitivity and so on and so forth. But it also has to do with brain health, and it actually has to do with bone health. So what do they find? They find that those patients that are on TPN for a long period of time, for whatever reason, tend to get weaker bones. So you could say, well, for those people who are in a coma and they're in the bed the whole time, obviously they weren't getting any exercise. True. All right. Check that off. But for others that were on TPN and did get exercise and did get, and they had their vitamin D because that was one of the vitamins in their TPN mix, they can rule these things out, and that they get weaker bones. So as an independent factor for bone growth and bone strength are incretins. And so you need to have your incretins secreted on a daily basis to some extent to be able to maintain that stimulus of bone formation and bone regeneration. And that's how bones grow and reformulate. That's why we work out. We put on different stresses on our bones. So that's pretty interesting, isn't it? So that these patients on TPN that were conscious got weaker bones simply because they really weren't eating anything down their gastrointestinal tract. The other thing is, in terms of gastric surgery, so those who are people who are really obese or choose not to consider diet for whatever reason, not a judgment there, they go into bariatric surgery. So in terms of bariatric surgery, it's basically the idea is, what if we block off the ability to eat large meals? That's more or less what it is. And so there's various ways to treat that. So there's roughly 3 different types of bariatric surgery, a banding, if you will. One is actually called gastric banding, which is like a collar around the top of your stomach. So the idea, you're always feeling full, but you can't eat very much. And so that's how that works. But in that situation, you still can eat. It just physically restricts food intake. And you have normal gut hormone. We didn't get into ghrelin and the other digestive hormones and so on and how that is. But you're still putting things down the the GI tract. So you have normal gut hormones, and insulin levels are pretty much unchanged, and patients feel hungry all the time. Then you have one that's called the Roux gastric bypass. What that is, it actually separates out most of the stomach and most of the small intestine from ever being used. So it goes from the top of the stomach, I almost say the bottom of the esophagus, but the top of the stomach, the connection's made all the way down to really the large intestine. And so the food goes from esophagus to barely the top of the stomach to the large intestine. And what it does there, it stimulates the incretin from the bottom part of the from the GI tract, called GPL. And so it gets a really strong GPL response. It basically is quote unquote healthy. These people keep the weight off longer, so they're eating very little. They have healthy insulin levels. They have obviously healthy incretin levels, and so their bones are fine and everything else. But they are the most successful long term in terms of reversing diabetes. So whether they actually ever learn how to change their diet and their lives and so on and so forth, I don't know enough about that. And then there's another one called sleeve gastrectomy, which is slicing part of your stomach longitudinally pretty much in half and reducing the stomach there. That does not have, for one, it doesn't stimulate very much in the way of incretins. And you return to being obese usually. Bariatric surgery has, and I'm throwing this out, not a specialist, around 70% or less. 70% to 90% of the people go back to being diabetic. But initially, all diabetes is reversed. So it's a pretty fascinating case studies on a case-by-case or collectively. But the Roux-en-Y, the fact that it connects from esophagus in essence, and I'm generalizing to the top of the large intestine, and you get a big kick of your incretins from that area of your GI tract, makes it independent, and it makes it far better than all the others. Okay, with that, we're done. Take care. Hi, this is Dr. Goldcamp. I just wanted to encourage you to send in your questions to Dr. Goldcamp at ketonaturopath.com. Many of you have, and so what I've done with these questions that gotten back to most of the people I email, but some of the questions that were so good, and if they were overlapping to other questions, I would combine them and try to put that into the topic of a podcast, either via one of the micro topics that are covered in an interview. As you know, we cover a lot of topics in any given interview, or some of my own sort of reporting, if you will, on some of these issues. So please keep the questions coming. Feel free to send in an email, and I will get back to you. One thing I want to say, a number of questions have come in which I've given this answer and the email didn't work. So just make sure that you're receiving at the same email that you sent it in. And I think that might have been the difficulty. So I look forward to your questions. I just wanted to make sure that you knew that I'm open to answer your questions. And I think this world of keto is not just black and white. You know, it's nice that it's simple, but it's not simple for some. I'm really trying to, go down as any of you who have listened to all my podcasts. We started way back when, history and evolution and epilepsy and so on and so forth. Now we're seeing some tremendous overlap in various mental disorders, such as schizophrenia or neurological disorders that are not just epilepsy. And also, just for people in losing weight, it's sometimes pretty complicated for them to engage in keto. And so they need some help. And so that's the whole point of, at least that's what I think I'm doing, is exploring the world of why are there other factors. And so in exploring some of those other factors, we've covered addiction, we've covered hormones, we've covered nutritional deficiencies, we've covered certain metabolic lab results, and we'll go further. We'll even get to more on genome and aspects. So these are all just contributions that make for an obstacle for some people to engage easily in the ketogenic diet. This is my belief, and these are the things that I've discovered. And I think other people have discovered some of these things, but not ever put them together. So stay listening, send in your questions, and I will definitely get back to you.